Now that you've read The Emperor's New Clothes, we're going to go through the plot diagram with it. The Emperor's New Clothes, of course, was a great little short story. Has a funny little twist to it. You may have grown up and heard this story before, or may have never even heard of it before. But anyway, we're going to go through the plot diagram and go through each little the elements. The beginning of the story, the exposition, is the Emperor's living a happy but selfish life. He's very vain and is only concerned with how he looks in his new clothes. He just doesn't care about what anybody thinks, what anybody does. He doesn't care what's going on with the citizens of his country. All he wants to do is wear his suits. He changes clothes every day. But the story just starts off kind of explaining just how selfish he is and just how vain he is and arrogant about his looks. Then we move along until we get to the conflict. The conflict starts when the two strangers, which they refer to as swindlers, come to town and they trick the king into letting them make him clothes. So that's where we see the conflict. So we've got these two swindlers that are coming in and they're tricking the emperor, which you could also call the emperor, into letting them make him these clothes that are supposed to show who's wise and who's stupid and who doesn't belong in their position. All along, we, the reader, we know that that's not what they're doing. They're actually robbing the king and tricking him, and they're proving a point that he's very vain. And so once we see the conflict, then we can begin the rising action, which is going to lead to our climax. So everything that we put in the plot diagram in the rising action has to stir this problem about the strangers, the swindlers, as they trick the king, the emperor. So the first thing we notice, the swindlers set up their looms and begin to pretend that they're weaving invisible clothes. Now remember, we know they're invisible, but no one else does. The swindlers know that, but no one else does. Then we have the emperor who's worried that he may not see the clothes and it may reveal that he is not fit to be the emperor and that he's stupid, like the swindler said. So he decides, I'm going to send my minister and I'm going to send another official and let them go see the clothes. But neither one of them can see the material when they get there. Again, the strangers are tricking everyone and they're getting all the money from the emperor. They're making money and they're sitting there laughing and realizing how crazy these people are to even think that they can see this material that they can't. Then the swindlers keep pretending to make the fabric, and the ones who don't see it are afraid. They're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid they're going to be seen as stupid. And so they are afraid. So they fake it to keep from looking stupid and to keep the emperor from knowing they're not fit for their position. So the swindlers are being very smooth, and the story is getting thicker and thicker, and more and more people are being swindled by these fake seamstresses. The big day arrives. The emperor's ready to show off his new clothes. As we get to the climax, and we realize, the reader, oh my goodness, what is he going to wear? There's nothing for him to see. And when they bring in the clothes for him to look at, we know that he can't see it. He knows he can't see it, but he still has to go with it. Then we reach the climax when the emperor literally goes out into the public without any clothes on. He just decides he's going to be too arrogant and prideful to admit, hey, look, I don't see it. Instead, he lets them slip the garments on him and he proceeds to go through the town without wearing anything. That's the climax. That's when we realize how vain and how arrogant and prideful this emperor is, that he's willing to lie to make himself look better. Then we have the falling action. So after the climax, the falling action is that none of the grown-ups want to admit when they're seeing the king walk through, the emperor walk through town. They don't want to admit that they can't see it. So they don't say anything about him being naked. And then finally, a little child innocently announces that he hasn't got anything on. And then the crowd realizes how foolish they had been, and they start to laugh. And that's when the king realizes that he's been swindled, that those weavers were lying to him. But it's too late. And so now the selfish and very foolish emperor has to finish the parade in humiliation in front of his people. And that's how the story ends. So I think he learned a lesson. All right, let's go down here to the bottom part of the plot diagram and let's talk about the characters. Our main characters, of course, are the emperor, the swindlers. Then we got some others, the minister and the official. They have a fairly major part, but the two main characters are the emperor and the swindlers. Where does this take place? What's the setting? Well, the story only tells us it's a great city. We don't know exactly the name of the city or the name of the country. We just know it's a big city who has an emperor. All right, and then the point of view. It's third person, it's omniscient because we know the thoughts of the minister, we know the thoughts of the official, we know the thoughts of the emperor. So we know the thoughts of more than one person, so it's third person omniscient. All right, then let's look at who the protagonist is. Who's the main character? Well, the story's all about the emperor, so he would be the protagonist. And who has given him the problem? Well, it's the swindlers, the weavers that come to town that lie to him. They are giving the emperor the problem. So they're the antagonist. So what type of conflict is it? External. It's an external conflict, and it's man versus man. So we've got the emperor versus the swindlers. This is a person, and these are persons, people. So it is external, and it's man versus man. All right, and then what's the author's purpose? Let me just remind you that anytime you read a fiction story, which is what this is, it's fake, it's made up, it's false, it's fake, it's fiction, it's always going to be to entertain. Whether it's scary, whether it's sad, whether it's funny, it doesn't matter. The author wrote this with the sole purpose to entertain you. So by default, when you're filling out a plot diagram, the author's purpose is always going to be to entertain. And what did we learn? What did the author want us, the reader, to learn from The Emperor's New Clothes? What are some life lessons that the characters learned or that we could learn from this story? And that's how we'd find out the theme. So, one of the themes could be pride and arrogance will lead to embarrassment. We've all done things out of pride sometimes, and it led to us being embarrassed about something. And surely, and of course, the emperor was very embarrassed once he realized he was undressed, walking in front of all of his people that should have been looking up to him, and they were seeing him walking through the town naked. Another thing that we could learn is don't be conceited. Don't think too highly of yourself. That's something that we can learn from the emperor. Don't be conceited. Again, this is our plot diagram. It's not perfect, but this is the beginning, is your exposition. And once you hit the conflict, once you figure out the conflict, then your rising action begins. The rising action, the events that we put here, we can't put everything here because it just won't fit. So we've got to pick the main events, the main things that happen that lead up to the climax. Once we see the turning point or the highest point of action, but in here we realize this is when the emperor is finally shown how foolish he is. He goes out in public without any clothes on. That's the turning point. Then we have the falling action. The falling action is usually only a few paragraphs. It's very short. It's towards the end of the story. Most of the time, your climax is towards the end of the story. Then you have a little bit of a falling action. That's where the events start tapering off. And the resolution is simply the last paragraph, maybe the last two sentences of the story. How does the story end? How are the loose ends tied up? And this is your plot diagram.